Long before alarm clocks, calendar apps, and the loud rustling of cereal boxes, the average villager in medieval Europe awoke to a gentler tyranny, the church bell. Not ringing for danger, no, heavens no, just announcing that it was time for everyone to mind their business and get milking, praying, or at the very least, shuffling towards some form of piety. You might think that once we parted ways with feudalism, livestock inside the house, and suspiciously gritty bread, we also let go of those bells echoing through our schedules. But oh no, the medieval day is still stitched into our lives in such subtle, insistent ways. You'd be forgiven for believing time itself moonlights as a monk. Take, for instance, the seemingly harmless 9-to-5 workday, a concept as modern as a latte, yet with roots tangled deep in monastic routine. Back in the 6th century, Saint Benedict, a man with suspiciously structured ideas for someone living in a cave, developed what's known as the Rule of Saint Benedict. In it, monks were to rise at precise hours, pray at fixed intervals called offices, and engage in labor somewhere between spiritual reflection and actual sweat. This regulation of time was meant to bring holy order to a chaotic world. And wouldn't you know it, centuries later, a version of this holy timetable remains, now involving meetings about quarterly reports instead of mass and manuscripts. We still follow this rudimentary routine, not because it's ideal, but because at some point it seemed simpler than involving livestock again. Then there's the curious case of office hours. Now, if you've ever been asked to return at an unspeakably inconvenient time because the office is closed, you have monks to thank for that too. Medieval monastic offices were not desks with squeaky chairs and passive-aggressive coffee mugs, but designated prayer sessions. The term office came from the Latin officium, meaning duty or service. And so office hours were, quite literally, hours of duty to God, or, in today's case, to Sandra from HR. And speaking of structured days and repetitive devotion, let's not forget porridge, wholesome, warm, and about as exciting as a grey Tuesday. Yet for centuries, porridge was the main event at breakfast, if you were lucky. It filled bellies with something resembling sustenance and left teeth mostly unbothered. Monks, peasants, and even noble households endured it with the same resigned enthusiasm with which we now greet oatmeal packets, flavoured with the hint of either apple or disappointment. Why porridge? Because cereal had not been invented yet, and mornings are still too early for chewing ambition. Even now, as we microwave our oats and Instagram them into falsely cheerful narrative arcs, the medieval spirit of just eat this and keep going endures. Oats never asked to be exciting. Oats simply asked for obedience. Now let's shuffle toward the door, shall we? The literal front door. Preposterously enough, the practice of doffing your hat upon entering someone's home, or nodding like a socially anxious owl, is partly a holdover from medieval customs steeped in feudal etiquette. Removing one's hat or helmet was a gesture of trust. Here, you see, it said, I place myself vulnerable to your sealing and hospitality alike. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we still perform miniature traces of these gestures when we shake hands, say hello, or hold the elevator in ways we deeply regret by the fifth awkward floor. Even weekends carry a faint whiff of medieval compromise. Sunday, the day of rest, meant a conspicuous lack of turning butter or sharpening scythes. It was, officially or not, a divine pause button. But what about Saturday? That cheeky fellow just loafing between Friday's toil and Sunday's reverence. That little luxury came mostly after labour unions pushed for shorter work weeks in the 19th century, But the notion of a pause in the week's relentless, muddy trudge started centuries earlier, punctuated by feast days and saintly excuses not to sweep the chicken into the hearth too early. All of which is to say, the world around us, who works when, who eats what with a spoon, and who nods first, owes a great deal to the kind of society where one's job title might have included the word miller, and the job hazard was wolf. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, curl into your favorite shape, and let's quietly close the chapter as the monastery bells fade into the distance. Again, if you've ever struggled to spell Wednesday, you're not alone. In fact, you're the latest in a long line of confused spellers stretching back over 1,000 years. The culprit, dear listener, is none other than the medieval English monk with a calendar and too much influence. The name Wednesday hails from the Old English Wodsdag, or Woden's Day, a tribute to the Norse god Odin, known around these parts by his Anglo-Saxon stage name, Woden. Yes, you're living in the echo of a weekly Odin fan club, and every time your spell check corrects Wednesday into something with a silent D that contributes absolutely nothing to civilization, you're unknowingly invoking ancient sky god bureaucracy. You may wonder why we never updated these day names to something more intuitive, like middle of the weekday or almost there day. Ah, but you forget, the medieval period was not known for its marketing department. Once those monks etched it into ecclesiastical calendars with quills and a little too much conviction, it stuck like porridge to a tunic. And just as days were named after gods to supposedly keep divine beings from scheduling over each other, the way we structure our weeks, 7 days, like a stutter from eternity, is another medieval relic we never questioned. The Babylonians started it, blaming lunar cycles, but medieval Europe clutched it firmly, perhaps because breaking up the week differently would require math. And math, in the Middle Ages, was regarded with all the warmth of a leper at a feast. Even the weekend, a concept we clutch with desperation every Friday, isn't as timeless as it feels. In fact, the idea of 2 whole days without ploughing fields, baking your own bread, or warding off plague wasn't widely accepted until much later. Medieval peasants might get a feast day off, assuming they weren't punished for excessive merrymaking. But a full Sabbath followed by a lazy Sunday, that would have sounded suspiciously like luxury, or worse, French. Now consider the hours of your day. The fact that we divide time into 24 hours, a concept stolen from Egyptian star-watching habits, seemed like a good idea in theory, but medieval clock keepers had ideas of their own. Monks weren't just praying out of piety, you see. They were the original time micromanagers. Their liturgical schedule demanded prayers at precise intervals, matins, Lord's Prime, and so on, parcelled out like heavenly TV time slots. And because light and shadow were their only clocks, the hour could be 60 minutes or 90, depending on the season. Winter hours dragged. Summer, like your lunch break, vanished too quickly. Imagine a world where an hour is whatever the sun says it is. Now you know why sundials weren't great for office meetings. Despite this chaos, something unexpected happened. We fell in love with routine. The rhythm of the medieval day, with all its bells, fasts, feasts, and inexplicable spelling, gave people structure in a time when a stubbed toe could lead to an unfortunate funeral. To be up with the call of prime, to kneel at vespers, to carve your days by rhythm rather than reason. Well, it was soothing, predictable even. And like many medieval traditions, it found its way into our modern lives dressed in different clothing. So next time you glance at your calendar app, squinting at WED and wondering why a day would need that many consonants, know that you're communing with centuries of bearded monks, Norse gods, and celestial schedules, all conspiring to get you to Friday with your sanity mostly intact. And speaking of sanity, there's another medieval oddity you probably perform today without realizing. Soothing, habitual, and just the teensiest bit mysterious. But we'll explore that little relic in the space between yawns, just ahead. In the cradle of medieval Europe, where candlelight flickered against stone walls and everyone smelled vaguely like goat, a surprisingly enduring tradition was quietly shaping our modern decorum, the one-way handshake. Yes, that universal gesture of good manners. The upright, right-handed clasp that signifies goodwill, treaties, and awkward corporate icebreakers has suspiciously medieval fingerprints all over it. Back in the days when armor was considered sensible travel attire and falconry was a viable weekend hobby, people were extremely concerned about whether or not the fellow approaching them might stab them in the spleen. In a world without centralized policing or Yelp reviews of nearby inns, instinctive distrusting was basically survival. Out of this gleaming sea of human paranoia emerged a charming little custom. Right hands were sword hands, and extending that hand palm open was equivalent to saying, "I'm not here to murder you. Let's be awkwardly cordial instead." And so, the handshake became a mutual disarming ritual. Two knights, meeting on a muddy path, might remove heavy gauntlets and crunch hands together in what was, effectively, a temporary non-aggression pact. Mentally, each was probably still listing escape routes and weak points in the other's armor. But socially, this was progress. Fast forward several hundred years, and despite most of us no longer carrying swords, or at least not wearing them to quarterly budget meetings, we're still gripping hands like medieval diplomats. The handshake has survived plagues, revolutions, video conferencing, and even pandemics that strongly suggested we stop touching each other altogether. And yet, old habits stick like chainmail in summer. Interestingly, the preference for the right hand wasn't just practical, it became enshrined. In medieval times, being left-handed wasn't just an inconvenience, it was suspicious. Left-handedness was literally seen as the sinister side, a holdover from the Latin sinistra, meaning left, but which evolved into, well, sinister. If you reached out with your left hand in 1327, someone might have assumed you were possessed, plotting something, or worse, French. To this very day, despite left-handed folks making up 10 to 12% of the population, and finally being allowed to enjoy scissors and spiral notebooks, the right-hand handshake remains the unspoken standard. We are, quite literally, performing an ancient de-escalation maneuver every time we conclude a sales pitch, introduce ourselves at weddings, or awkwardly say goodbye at family functions after already saying goodbye 3 times. But the etiquette doesn't stop at our digits. Consider this. When sitting at a formal dinner, our utensil placement still comes from feudal hierarchy. The knife, used with the dominant hand, was placed on the right for aristocrats, who were right-handed by divine default. Meanwhile, fork usage was a curious novelty, only adopted slowly and with suspicion. After all, what kind of person impales their food with metal prongs when they have perfectly functional fingers and a way to pray for forgiveness later? The echoes of medieval manners can also be seen in how we walk on sidewalks or pavements, for our more stoic British listeners. Traditionally, a Lady TM would walk on the right, nearer the buildings, while the gentleman, who was probably named Sir Edgar and smelled faintly of cheese and conquest, would walk closer to the street. Why? To shield her from the delightful hazards of medieval roadways, runaway carts, flung chamber pots, and the occasional too enthusiastic town crier. Now, in our modern era of automotive traffic and plumbing, some people still reflexively stick to this practice, especially during dates, where it is less about social survival and more about collecting subconscious romance points. No one's expecting a Honda Civic to splash them in a puddle, but somehow the dance of ancient chivalry continues, reinforced by generations of etiquette books and the firm wagging fingers of grandmothers everywhere. So next time you extend a hand for a shake or subtly switch sides on a stroll, know that you're engaging in silent rituals crafted long ago, not by etiquette coaches or HR departments, but by people in pointy shoes who thought soup was a luxury and squirrels were mildly demonic. We inherited their customs, polished them, and continue to unknowingly cosplay our feudal ancestors every time we say "pleased to meet you" instead of "identify yourself, traveller." And just around the cobbled corner, another curiously medieval remnant quietly shapes how we conduct the world's most sacred of rituals, standing in lines, or as the British have patriotically dubbed it, queuing. But more on that dreamy little system in just a moment. Long before supermarkets groaned under the weight of 23 varieties of oat milk and council meetings debated the civil rights of pigeons, there existed a simpler life. Well, perhaps not simpler, but certainly muddier. In the misty early mornings of medieval Europe, people woke not to smartphone alarms, but to the dulcet tones of roosters who somehow managed to crow directly into your soul. And as they rose, scratching their woolen tunics and trying to remember whether fleas were supposed to be this enthusiastic, they lived by rules. Rules we still cling to centuries later, like feudalism never left our group chat. Take, for instance, the 6-day work week. Yes, we pretend it's 5, but Saturdays have long since been colonized by emails, errands, and what economists now refer to as that one last thing that takes 5 hours. This ever so reliable rhythm can be traced, like a mouldy string of breadcrumbs, back to the medieval church calendar. Sundays, of course, were sacred, which is medieval for nobody loud is allowed. On that day, peasants were theoretically excused from labor, though in practice, they still had to churn butter, or someone would mutiny over dry barley toast. But the other 6 days? Unrelenting toil. In the 10th century, the idea of labor laws was as imaginary as dragons. In fact, dragons were more legally protected. But here's the twist so gentle, it could tuck your slippers in. Despite all the labor, medieval peasants technically had more vacation time than many of us now. Between saints' days, feast days, and festivals that appeared to involve alarming quantities of ale and unregulated jousting, the average medieval labourer could have 80 to 100 days off per year, more than the modern American worker. Because, as odd as it sounds, when you don't have an HR department, it's surprisingly easy to take a mental health day in honour of St. Swibbles the Slightly Real. Then there's the humble footpath, that narrow ribbon of earth where we politely walk dogs, jog in place while staring at our Fitbits, or question our life choices on misty morning strolls. Many of these paths, especially in Europe, trace directly over ancient right-of-way routes from the Middle Ages. That's right, there are sidewalks out there with more historical credentials than your local castle-themed pizza parlour. You see, in medieval England, the concept of the right of way was so seriously regarded that even if a path ran directly through someone's turnip patch, if a certain number of villagers had trod it for so many years, it became public domain. These were called customary paths, which sounds quaint, like something you'd embroider on a pillow. But to the serfs and shepherds of the day, they were golden corridors of movement, essential for getting from field to field, from market to monastery, or from beer to slightly better beer. And just like that, we're still building roads and walking routes along these centuries-old trails because somewhere around 1273, Brother Alfie and his goat named Maurice just absolutely needed to get to the cider barn in a straight line. But medieval carryovers don't stop at roads or overworked Wednesdays. Oh no, let's talk about court. Today's courtroom procedures, with their stern decorum, ritualized phrases like "Your Honor," and that one person always showing up dressed like they're ready for midnight brunch, are tinted ever so politely in medieval paint. The roots of modern legal language stem from Norman French, brought over after one highly assertive invasion in 1066. Words like bailiff, attorney, and even jury have medieval fingerprints all over them, delicately smeared like jam on a vellum manuscript. The whole notion of trial by jury evolved from practices that, in earlier centuries, might have involved literal trials by ordeal, where innocence was proved by not dying dramatically. As the centuries passed, these ideas were gently scrubbed and reshaped, like a cathedral-side gargoyle polished by rainfall and artistic reinterpretation. And so, the medieval obsession with oaths, testimonies, and swearing on God's good name became the framework for today's justice systems, albeit with fewer leeches and considerably more Excel spreadsheets. And just when you think the parade of medieval leftovers might leave you yawning like a sack of turnips, we haven't even opened the door to everyone's favorite feudal invention, surnames. But we'll get to that. As the stars continue their slow wheel above, and the gentle rustle of parchment invites us onward into the night, picture this. It's a fog-draped morning in a medieval English village. The roosters are shouting their opinions at nobody in particular. The thatched roofs are still cozy from yesterday's smoke, and someone is trudging through dew-soaked grass to attend the town meeting. Yes, the town meeting, a beloved pastime only slightly less thrilling than watching wheat grow. But here's the kicker. We still attend those kinds of meetings today, and the format has barely changed since the 12th century. Standing up, mumbling complaints about taxes, then abruptly disagreeing about the location of the new public latrine. It's all part of a grand tradition dating back over 800 years. You see, the medieval English folk gave us more than just the Magna Carta and suspicious mead recipes. They gave us the first inklings of local governance by gathering the townspeople, or at least those who owned something pointy and feudal, to make decisions communally. This may sound noble until you realize it mostly involves sturdy men debating where the pigs should be banned from roaming freely. In fact, many modern rules owe their existence to these very pig-related squabbles. Take the modern tradition of zoning laws. Yes, zoning. The reason why your neighbour can't open a nightclub called Ye Olde Rave House across from the elementary school. The concept started in medieval townships where certain trades were pushed to the outskirts. Bakers near the centre, blacksmiths by the river, tanners as far away as possible, both due to the smell and their suspicious fondness for boiling animal hides at odd hours. You might also thank, or gently blame, the medieval clerk for your signature block on official forms today. That's right. In days of old, scribes and monks spent their lives copying records by hand, often in painful Latin, while the noblemen dictated things like, "Be it known that Lord Reggie shall not be responsible for the goat incident." Scribal tradition demanded elaborate closings and flourishes, which today live on in our obsession with full names, multiple checkboxes, and "please sign here, here, and here." A holdover from the days when documents came with wax seals and occasionally crumbs from a scribe's lunch. Even more persistent are our medieval ideas of dress codes. Imagine a world where you could be fined for wearing ermine if you weren't a duke, or for sporting purple unless you had royal blood, or at least outrageously good lighting. These were known as sumptuary laws, and they were all about keeping you in your place, visually. Poorer folk had to make do with browns and greys, while the wealthy pranced about in silks that whispered, "I absolutely overpaid for this." While we no longer enforce these laws, thankfully your sweatpants are safe, echoes remain. Consider the unspoken rule that a judge must wear a robe, or that certain restaurants require a jacket, tie, and quiet shame. But possibly, the most curious medieval hangover is our affection for witnessing. In our legal system, we are still compelled to call upon the presence of an impartial witness. This is directly descended from trial customs, when neighbours swore on their lives that they saw you not steal the bishop's chicken, or, in awkward cases, that you absolutely did. Back then, your reputation as a witness mattered more than your evidence. If people liked you, they believed you. If they didn't, well, good luck avoiding the stocks. Today, we do love our notarized testimony, court affidavits, and that eccentric uncle at weddings who insists on giving a full speech as a witness to your love. And then there's our passion for queuing, a sacred tradition in the British Isles especially, where forming a line is both ritual and sport. Though queuing, as we know, it is a more recent development, the roots stretch to medieval monasteries and markets, where order was imposed by bells, wooden tokens, or that one frightening monk with the staff of "wait your turn." In markets, buyers queued for bread and fish, lest they experience the wrath of old Edna the fishmonger, who did not tolerate cutting in line. So here we are, still attending town meetings, following dress codes, signing declarations, queuing like saints, and zoning our tanners with care. All because a few earnest people, centuries ago, decided that life would be better with a little bit of order and a whole lot of parchment. And somewhere, deep in the annals of history, a medieval scribe is still waiting for someone to stop talking so he can finish writing the minutes. Let us now gently wander from these structured shadows of society to a quieter, more domestic arrangement, something so ingrained in our lives that we barely notice it. Yet it too began under flickering torchlight and the ever-watchful eye of tradition. There's something oddly comforting about closing a door, the satisfying click that tells you the world is now slightly farther away. But did you know? We're still following medieval etiquette every time we swing one open. Enter the curious customs of medieval door behavior. Yes, door behavior. Because in the Middle Ages, opening the door wasn't just a mechanical motion. It was a social performance, one that came with rules. So many rules, in fact, you'd think the door was nobility and you were courting it. You see, in medieval courts and castles, doors weren't merely passages, they were portals of rank and status. Quite literally the difference between a guest and an intruder, or a knight and a nuisance. Let me paint a scene. You're Sir Reginald of Chipping Marsh, a moderately respected knight known mostly for having once jousted a tree by mistake. You approach the great hall of Lord Pendlebury. The door, large enough to warrant its own postal code, is closed. Do you knock? Do you push? Do you bellow hello in a heroic voice? No, and definitely no. You wait. Because medieval door etiquette demanded that one never just barged in, especially not upon a noble or a gathering. Instead, you waited for a servant to open the door from the inside. It was considered terribly rude, even treasonous, to open a noble's door uninvited. On the peasantry level, doors were less ceremonious, but even then, you knocked 3 times, sometimes with a little tune, because door knocking was how you said, "Hello, I am not here to rob you." And so grew the ritual of knocking. Centuries later, it's still with us. Knock knock, who's there? An ancient form of signalling that you're friendly, or at least not armed. But lest you think door etiquette ended there, hang on to your nightcap. Medieval people were deeply suspicious of open doors. A door left open was not just a draft risk. It was an invitation to mischief. Thieves, rats, rumours, and worst of all, relatives dropping in. So homes had heavy doors, often reinforced and latched from the inside. Today, our doors may be made of fiberglass and optimism, but that instinct remains. Ever felt uneasy until your front door's locked at night? That's medieval peace of mind, passed down through squeaky hinges. Oh, and the phrase holding the door for someone. A modest modern courtesy with noble medieval origins. Back then, if you stumbled across a noble trying to exit a chamber, it was proper to hold the door. With a bow, "Thank you very much." It was a way of showing respect, deference, and ensuring you weren't standing between a baron and his breakfast. That act of deference soft evolved into the modern gesture we know today. Holding the door for someone juggling coffee, a laptop, and the last scraps of their dignity. And then we come to thresholds, the mysterious line where one room ends and another begins, usually ignored unless you're doing yoga or carrying a bride. But in medieval times, thresholds had literal substance. Homes often had raised wooden lips at the base of the doorway to keep clay floors from washing out during a rain. These wooden strips were known aptly as thresholds because they held in the thresh a mix of straw and chaff that covered the floor and smelled faintly of chickens on vacation. Step over the threshold today, and you're unknowingly crossing a historically muddy divide. Speaking of historical mud, high heels, yes, those, originated not in glamour, but in medieval practicality. Riders, especially messengers and certain horseback soldiers, wore a kind of early high heel to stay better secured in the saddle. Horseback fashion, believe it or not, made its way to courtly dress, where nobles adopted the heeled look to signal they weren't peasants who had to walk anywhere. So if you've ever tottered in stilettos for the sake of elegance, you're part of an unbroken line of impractical equestrian style statements. Now roll that quirky little tidbit around your sleepy mind. Every shoelace tied, every door gently closed, every surprised, "Oh, pardon me," uttered as you pass someone. Each a dusty relic from ages when people still thought bathing once a month was self-indulgent. And the next time, someone knocks at your door just so, or insists you hold it open to show how very civilized we all are. Remember that you're participating in a medieval choreography of politeness. One slow, creaky hinge at a time. But our night stroll through archaic architecture doesn't end at the doorframe. Let's take a few dreamy steps further, into a long-forgotten forest of laws where grass was illegal and your lawn could get you fined. In the medieval mind, order was everything. Not just the thundering kind that came from a king's decree or a knight's gallop, but a quieter, stranger kind, the kind that insisted your fork absolutely must go on the left. That's right. Tonight, we dine with etiquette, or rather, we doze through its origins, because deep in the tapestries of feast and faint candlelight lies the curious tale of table manners, many of which were invented in the Middle Ages for reasons now long vanished like a roasted pheasant at a hungry lord's banquet. First, picture a long, creaky wooden table in a poorly lit stone hall. The year, somewhere in the 14th century. The smell, a questionable stew of turnips, sweat, and medieval optimism. Plates, rare. More likely, you were handed a square of old bread called a trencher, which soaked up your food and the conversation. Dining, at that time, was less about savouring and more about surviving. Still, certain rules emerged, not necessarily to civilize the masses, but to prevent things like stabbings over soup. For starters, let's consider the humble knife. Back then, everyone brought their own. It was your eating tool and your self-defense mechanism. So naturally, people started getting a little nervous about all the daggers at the dining table. That's when the rule, "Don't lick your knife," came about. Not because it was impolite, mind you, but because someone might think you were sharpening it with your tongue in preparation for vengeance. A social no-no. Similarly, it became impolite to reach across the table. Not out of courtesy, but because you might knock over someone's goblet, or worse, knock someone into a squabble over spilled mead, an offence that could end with you pitched out into a very pointed hedge. And napkins. This is where the story turns dreamy. You see, medieval folks didn't initially have napkins. Not really. Your tunic sleeve did a lot of the dirty work. Eventually, tablecloths were introduced, but not for show. Guests wiped their hands directly on the cloth. Yes, the entire banqueting table was essentially one large shared napkin. Talk about communal dining. In the fancier courts of France, things changed a bit. Cloths the size of bed sheets were draped over laps and blessedly dubbed nappe, or little table. Over time, they made their way under plates and around necklines, evolving, eventually, into the sad, thin square that now nervously waits on your restaurant knee. Still, we inherited many practices from this ancient obsession with mealtime manners. For instance, the reason we say "bless you" when someone sneezes at the table dates back to medieval superstition. Sneezing was thought to expel not just germs, but possibly demons. An instinctive benediction became an etiquette habit we follow to this day. You might not believe in rogue demons anymore, but that doesn't stop you from murmuring "bless you" within 2 nanoseconds of a nasal eruption. Now, let's talk about how we arrange people. The concept of the head of the table, another beautifully medieval hangover. In a noble household, the lord of the manor would sit at the end, a position from which he could see and command everyone. His presence added authority and, importantly, distance from the food fights, or less dramatically, flying crumbs. Children and lesser folk sat further down, near the cold vegetables and the draught. Even today, dinner parties often honour the head seat, a practice that survives despite the fact that no one is generally concerned about ambushers entering through the side door with poisoned potatoes. There's also the elaborate obsession with cutlery placement, which can be traced to the courts of Louis XIII, though it was deeply inspired by earlier medieval rituals. Forks, for example, were rare and suspicious at first. Two-pronged and devilishly pitchforky, their initial introduction caused quite a stir. Why stab your food when God gave you fingers? But eventually, forks gained traction, first in Byzantium, then Italy, and finally in France and England, where they were adopted in the name of refined conduct. To this day, many of us still follow the outside-in cutlery rule at formal dinners, a system dreamed up to guide guests through the dozen or so meals of a typical upper-class medieval feast. How many courses do you usually have? 2, maybe 3. And yet, the fork ballet endures. And so, every time you place your napkin just so, or carefully avoid licking your knife clean of cheesecake, you are unwittingly reenacting a 1,000-year-old pageant of decorum, a delicate dance choreographed by candlelight and necessity. But manners weren't the only medieval inventions that snuck into modern life. As the tapestries flicker and the spoons gently clink, we'll wander now toward another curious survival, one stitched deep into the seams of ordinary days. Imagine walking into a courtroom, oak-panelled, solemn, and full of people adjusting their glasses far too slowly. The judge enters and everyone stands up. Why? Tradition, they say. Respect, they murmur. But if you trace that one back far enough, you'll find yourself nose to chainmail with a medieval king who just really liked it when people stood when he walked into a room. In the Middle Ages, especially in feudal courts, standing for a superior wasn't just courtesy, it was required, as in stand or risk losing your head required. Peasants, nobles, and even minor-level archbishops were expected to rise whenever royalty or high-ranking lords entered. They weren't just stretching their legs, you see. They were participating in an elaborate dance of status and submission, a sort of human pop-up book showing who held the power, and we've kept it. To this day, we stand in courtrooms, at weddings, and before national anthems begin, all part of a now gentler echo of medieval deference. Most of us stand for judges not because we fear being drawn and quartered, but because furniture etiquette from the 12th century got stuck in our cultural hard drive. But it gets delightfully stranger. Let us now wander into the world of shoes, with a brief stop at medieval sumptuary laws. Ah, sumptuary laws. Those delightful little decrees designed to control what people could or couldn't wear based on their social class. You see, during the reigns of kings with names like Edward, Henry, or the Third, people were enamored with long, pointy shoes. The longer the toe, the higher your status. These shoes, known as poulaines, became so absurdly long that some needed to be tied to a man's shin with small chains to keep from dragging on the ground. Imagine entering a feast sideways like a majestic duck. Eventually, sumptuary laws clamped down. Only the wealthiest were permitted the longest toes. Now, we may not have laws about shoe length today, but the echoes are still there. You can stroll into a gala in red-soled stilettos that cost more than a used car, and heads will turn in very class-conscious recognition. The laws may be gone, but the social signalling remains gloriously petty, just a touch more Instagram-friendly. From footwear to food. Ever wonder why table settings are so elaborate? Or why multiple forks exist, each with its own pompous little title? This is also a medieval leftover. In the late medieval era, the upper classes began to adopt increasingly complex table manners to distinguish themselves from the unrefined masses. It wasn't just about being clean, it was about being better. Other people ate with their hands. Nobles dined with silver mystery sticks. Knife in the right hand, fork in the left. Unless you're in a different country where it's the opposite. Napkin on the lap, but not until your host does, unless it's the Queen, who gets her own rules entirely. It can feel like trying to solve a polite riddle. And although Emily Post did eventually tidy things up, The origins of this formality lie very much in feuding medieval households, trying to outmanner each other with increasingly complicated dinner ceremonies. If you've ever pretended to know which wine glass is yours, congratulate yourself. You've just waded through centuries of etiquette warfare. And speaking of warfare, let's talk about handshakes. That common greeting, so ordinary now, has distinctly medieval roots. In an age when carrying swords was the fashion equivalent of wearing Apple Watches today, ubiquitous and slightly excessive, the handshake began as a gesture of peace. By offering the right hand, you were quite literally showing that you weren't about to stab someone. A gentleman would extend his weapon-bearing hand, palm up, as if to say, "See? No dagger today." We've kept the gesture, but lost the blades. And while your modern handshake might signal, "I'm professional and composed," it all began as a clunky security screening disguised as a friendly greeting. Medieval airport, if you will, except nobody was taking off their chainmail boots. Traditions, it seems, have long legs, sometimes pointy-toed, sometimes silver-forked, always a bit ridiculous. But under the oddness lies a strange comfort, a bridge to a time when people were just as weird and wonderful as we are, only with more hay and fewer dentists. Now, if you're still awake, and just between us, you shouldn't be. You might find it amusing to visit the medieval origins of something even more bizarre. Spoiler, it involves makeup, morality, and a very suspicious shade of pale. Long before the glittering bustle of modern etiquette blogs or the soothing reassurance of email auto-replies, there existed a curious obsession with silence, specifically the awkward, obligation-laden pause we still call waiting our turn. Ah yes, medieval queuing. It existed, sort of, and more importantly, its ghost still lingers in our modern lives, grinning in the form of standing in line for coffee, waiting to speak in meetings, and the unspoken social contract that we all act as though meetings are important. But let's go back, shall we? Imagine a medieval market. The smells are a mix of spiced honey cakes, warm wool cloaks, and exactly what you think a herd of donkeys in July might smell like. Chaos hums all around, vendors shouting, coins clinking, and someone disputing loudly over the weight of a duck. And yet, even amid this cacophony, a strange form of social choreography was taking place. Medieval folk, you see, didn't exactly queue like we do. Lines weren't orderly ropes of humans snaking toward a Starbucks kiosk, but there was still a rudimentary pecking order. The rich, they got served first. The knight in shining armor, first pick of the turnips. The miller's apprentice. Wait your turn, lad. Wait your turn. This early social queuing was less about civility and more about status and elbows. Enterprising peasants learned quickly that brute force or persuasive whining could shave minutes off their bread buying time, and thus an early foreshadowing of the modern DMV was born. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Renaissance brings with it art, science, and oddly enough, a fetish for orderliness. With literacy rising and bureaucracy blossoming, people began lining up, not just out of necessity, but from a sort of grim, inherited politeness. Enter the rule of the queue, the unspoken agreement that the first person arrives, then the second, and so on, each slotting quietly behind the next, like saints in a stained glass window, or cats waiting around a suspiciously warm laptop. But where does the strangeness truly appear? Well, it's in how we've kept this medieval logic in situations where it absolutely no longer makes sense. Like waiting in a call center queue, listening to Beethoven's Fifth for 47 minutes, only to be told you've called the wrong department. Or using a ticket system at the bakery where you awkwardly stand 3 feet apart like you're in a polite bread standoff. We queue at concerts. We queue to get off planes we don't even want to be on. We queue online now, represented by spinning circles and little loading bars. Our ancestors would be baffled and yet impressed by our dedication to organized disappointment. What makes it even stranger is how seriously we take it. Have you ever seen someone cut in line at a post office? Grown adults bristle, nostrils flare. The social outrage is immediate and silent. You can almost hear a lute of judgment strumming in the background. This medieval holdover isn't just about queues, of course. It's about the very idea of taking turns, patiently enduring your place in a larger procession of humanity. A kind of soft, collective martyrdom. The roots of this practice go back even further. Ancient Rome had rules on public speaking rotations, and monasteries enforced strict rotation schedules for meals and confession, lest some poor novice hog all the barley stew or monopolize sin time. In essence, what we thought was just suburban patience is, in fact, a deep historical ritual of cosmic fairness, with a dash of passive aggression. And as you're drifting more deeply now, imagine an ever-sleepy monk, head nodding in the scriptorium, who missed his daily confession slot due to a long monastic queue. He simply sighed, waited another 7 hours, and wrote lovingly about patience in the margins of a buttery manuscript. So, next time you find yourself in a line at a coffee shop, muttering that it shouldn't take 5 minutes to froth almond milk, remember, you're not just waiting. You're participating in a cultural ceremony that began when knights barged into bakeries and peasants invented muttering under their breath. Somewhere inside you, a medieval soul is nodding, patiently. And speaking of medieval oddities we refuse to let go of, let's turn toward an old law that means you might technically still owe your neighbors a portion of your fence. Once upon a time, not quite long ago in cosmic terms, but still a fair distance beyond yesterday, in the winding alleyways of medieval bureaucracy, there slouched a concept so boring, so absurd, and so deeply embedded in our daily lives that we rarely question it. Standardized paper sizes. That's right. Buckle up, because tonight we're gliding gently through the surprisingly medieval origins of why your printer jams, only when it's most inconvenient. Now, before you drift too far into the parchment-scented mists of sleep, consider this. Somewhere in the old annals of the Holy Roman Empire, someone decided, quite arbitrarily, you might say, that paper ought to come in standard shapes. This wasn't due to a divine ordinance nor scribal revelation. No angel descended holding a correctly measured scroll. It was, as many things are in history, a matter of convenience and taxation. You see, producing paper in the 14th century wasn't like feeding a tree into a paper shredder on steroids. It was artisanal, delicate, and if we're being brutally honest, rather full of accidents. Paper was made by pressing pulp into molds that had to match the frames known quaintly as decals. The size of these decals, not determined by science, not determined by art, but instead by what could reliably be carried, counted, or taxed. And so, through centuries of scribes left squinting and accountants furrowing their brows under wax-dripped lanterns, a peculiar size rose to prominence, the A paper series. Medieval monks and clerks didn't know it at the time, but by simply needing folios that could be halved neatly without errant fractions mucking things up, they seeded the foundations of the A4 tyranny that governs your office printer tray today. Of course, in the land of the free, and many other places that looked at metrication and said, "No thank you," we ended up with the delightfully uncooperative letter size. Ah yes, 8.5 inches by 11 inches bestowed upon us by bureaucratic battles in the 1920s, with ancestry allegedly reaching back to 17-inch hand-pressed sheets from colonial paper mills. Why 17? Because someone liked halves, but also liked chaos. Yet somewhere in the DNA of these decisions lies something even older: medieval feudal record-keeping, taxation, census rolls, land transfers, all required ink and parchment. And they had to be preserved, stored, stacked. Enter the birth of uniform document sizes, so that scribes and clerks, and later binders and file keepers, weren't constantly building little paper-sized ladders to keep things from slipping off shelves like academic Jenga. But the legacy doesn't stop with shapes and sizes. No, consider the noble tradition of margins, those peaceful blank borders surrounding our essays, letters, and regrettable shopping lists. Where did they come from? Practicality, yes. Mistakes, indeed. But more crucially, rats. Medieval scribes learned the hard way that parchment stored in monasteries made an excellent buffet for rodents. So they began leaving wide margins as a buffer zone, a sort of pest insurance. That way, if a mouse fancied a medieval midnight snack, the text, so painstakingly hand-copied, might yet survive the chomping. These borders, initially born from rat defense strategies, became an aesthetic, and then a tradition, then a formatting rule. And now every document template silently honors generations of scribes, rodents, and the vermin prevention policies of yore. Even the phrase white space in modern design echoes this ancient layering of form and function. So next time you open a Word doc and leave those margins untouched, take a moment, brief though it may be, to acknowledge that you're participating in a centuries-old compromise between humans and mice. And what about filing systems? The folders, tabs, hanging file cabinets that whisper softly from dark corners of your home office. Medieval record keepers stored parchment in bundles called fascicles, wrapped in cloth and labelled with string tags. No metal clips, no colour-coded labels. But the same logic pulses through both systems. What's dated, what's urgent, what's been paid, and what might get you thrown in the stocks if you forget it. So here we are, generations and many forest clearings later, sticking stubbornly to sizes and systems dreamed up by taxmen, papermakers, and rodent-fearing scribes. We grumble at auto-formatting but never ask why it's there. We accept that a margin must be 1 inch, even if deep in our bones we know the rats have long since left the building. Lie back now. The dim lanterns of the scriptorium flicker low. The rustle of vellum, the distant scratching of a quill. These gentle echoes of organized scribbling drift outward across time. And somewhere amid the shelves of forgotten parchments is a tale not just of what paper we use, but how we queue for our bread. Strange, oh yes, but perhaps in the next tender breath of night we'll wander there too. Long, long ago, when trousers were a two-person operation, and table manners involved a very sharp knife and very few rules, there emerged a system of measurement that still clings to us like a medieval ghost, with a tape measure, the inch, the foot, the yard, all quaint little units, raised in the shadow of kings, elbows, and other limbs that should never have been scientific instruments. Let's begin with the humble foot. This is not a reference to feet in general, nor to the specific foot of a noble lord, although that's exactly where the story squelches into relevance. In medieval England, the foot, as a unit of measurement, was brace yourself, based on somebody's actual foot, which somebody, likely a king, possibly Henry I, who was reputed to have a foot that measured exactly 12 inches. So naturally, he declared it law, an early example of royal overreach. And overarch, as the case may be. Now, stop for a moment and let that reality settle into your duvet. A measurement system that, for generations, took as its gold standard some sovereign's shoe size. You can practically hear the peasants whispering, "All hail His Majesty's orthopedics." To make matters more deliciously arbitrary, the inch, our scrap of gentleness in the jigsaw of rulers, was based on the length of 3 barleycorns laid end to end. Not just any barleycorns, obviously. Oh no. They had to be dry and round, which is code for wildly inconsistent. Barleycorns aren't known for their emotional stability or cooperative tendencies. Imagine a serious medieval clerk, ink staining his sleeves, laying barleycorns next to one another by candlelight. He's squinting. The barleycorns are being difficult. One's bloated from a damp harvest. Another has delusions of grandeur. Meanwhile, outside his drafty office, time and civilization march forward with little clue that centuries hence, people will measure televisions, babies, and cake pans using this same hopeless botany experiment. And yards. Oh, now we're just having fun. The yard, some argue, may have been the measurement from the king's nose to his extended thumb. Others say hip bone to ankle, or that it was the length of a man's stride. Each theory proudly highlighting the beautiful chaos of medieval standardization. A yard meant something, but nobody agreed on quite what. Yet, here we remain, centuries later, using yardsticks to measure drapery and indecision at fabric stores across the world. Then there's the mile, a word that actually predates the medieval period, tracing back to the Latin mille passuum, or 1,000 paces. But it was joyfully warped in the British Isles, where a statute mile was eventually pegged at exactly 5,280 feet. Why? Because in 1592, Queen Elizabeth III decided it would be awfully clever to make agricultural measurements more consistent, and everyone nodded politely, though no one quite understood how that specific number helped anyone, least of all the farmers. Thus, a measurement of 1,000 Roman strides inflated into a sprawling funk of math and monarchy. The result? Generations of schoolchildren scratching their heads and muttering about converting feet to miles and back again, as though embarking on some small and senseless pilgrimage. But here's where the warm socks of irony truly kick in. Despite the advent of the metric system, a sleek, sensible system favoured by scientists, astronauts, and virtually every country except a few plucky holdouts, these medieval measures cling on. We build houses in feet, run marathons in miles, and blame weight gain on ounces that accumulate like fairy dust. Why? Tradition, habit, and perhaps a quiet respect for the charming ridiculousness of it all. Because buried underneath the absurdity is something deeply human. A need to codify our world using what we know, even if what we know is the length of a king's royal arch, or the grainy girth of a barleycorn. So, as you switch off overhead lights and think about the imprecision lurking in your shortest ruler, know this. Some traditions survive not because they're flawless, but because they make our messy world feel just organized enough. And speaking of organized messes, let us now wander ever so gently into the shimmering world of medieval surnames, those awkward yet enduring badges that once said, "Here's who I am, where I'm from." And yes, I probably churn butter on the weekends. Picture, if you will, a narrow cobbled street in a sleepy village, the kind of place where sheep have right of way, and the baker's sourdough is more respected than the local mayor. It's the year 1375, give or take a plague or two, and a buttery breeze wafts from someone's roasting mutton. Life moves at the pace of a horse with sore knees, slow, steady, and thoroughly unimpressed by modern urgency. And here, tucked between a thatched roof and 7 bored chickens, lies the odd origin of something you probably did today without even realizing it. Something medieval, bizarrely preserved in all its dusty glory. You put your knife on the right side of the plate, didn't you? Fork on the left. Oh ho, you're part of it. Table manners. Yes, those delicate rituals we call dining etiquette. The ones whispered by your grandmother with a stern look and a gentle smack of your hand for daring to eat peas with a knife, are charming little fossils from medieval European courts, where, contrary to what legends suggest, not everyone was sword fighting and throwing goblets of ale into the fire. No, some were very concerned about where your elbows went. Back then, long before IKEA proudly handed us flatware in minimalist brown boxes, the fork was more rumour than reality. People often ate with knives, fingers, and something delightfully named trencher bread, a stale slice used as an edible plate, soaked by stew and eventually dispatched to the poor, the dogs, or, if you were feeling cheeky, your neighbour's chickens. The peasants, of course, ate humbler fare, and didn't have the luxury of worrying where one placed one spoon, if they had a spoon at all. Now, courtly etiquette, crafted in part by the church, and in part by the noble obsession with displaying which of them was the most refined beast at the feast, evolved into a theatre of absurd politeness. Manuals were written, honestly printed, by candlelight, with ink made out of oak galls and boiled gum. One particularly stern guide suggested that thou shalt not wipe thy dripping nose upon the tablecloth, which tells you a lot about what people were getting up to when the roast duck started flying. In a time when bathing was more suggestion than routine, and spices were not just flavour, but status symbols. Pepper was pricey enough to be guarded under lock and tiny medieval key. The idea of behaving properly at the table was more than just niceties. It was class warfare with cutlery, and the fork, poor misunderstood little trident, had a scandalous start. When it tiptoed into European courts from Byzantium, it was considered morally suspicious. One theologian declared it an insult to God, because food, in his divine wisdom, went from hand to mouth, unmediated by metal prongs. Goodness, imagine what they'd think of the air fryer. As for your modern ceremony of napkins, placemats, and waiting politely so Terence can pass the butter before anyone dares sip the soup, these are just echoes. Today's cutlery choreography descends straight from those lavish, gluttonous, and heavily scented feasts, left over not because anyone questioned their usefulness, but because no one remembered to question them at all. Why do we place the knife to the right? Because once upon a slice of venison, people expected any respectable gentleman to be right-handed and armed. Yes, quiet dinner conversations were mildly improved by having your dominant hand free to defend yourself. Dinner was dinner, but it was also politics, and nothing says, "Please pass the salt," like the silent threat of a hidden dagger under your tunic. It's strange, really, how these rituals endure. Nobody's likely to spar over roasted pheasant these days, but we still cling to the structure. Elbows in, napkin on lap. Don't clink your spoon on the bowl like a wind chime in a hurricane. We keep doing it, not because we must, but because deep within our soft human hearts, we love a little order, even if it was invented by someone wearing woolen tights and suspiciously long shoes. So next time you set the table, think of all the powdered faces, feathered hats, and serious men who would rather perish than witness a dessert fork misaligned. In a way, you're part of a centuries-long performance, a silent, silly little tribute to a medieval dinner party none of us were invited to, and yet none of us have quite left. Speaking of invitations, there's another curious piece of medieval etiquette you've probably followed without knowing. One that has everything to do with the way we say goodbye. But let's ease into it gently as our candle flickers low and the soup cools. In the hushed stillness of twilight, when even the owls are considering a bedtime snack and the moon is politely waiting its turn, let us tiptoe into one of the most peculiar legacies medieval folk have left us: the inexplicably stubborn habit of eating meals in 3 separate acts: breakfast, lunch, dinner. Each arrives like characters in a pompous stage play. First, the humble breakfast, all warm toasted promises and orange juice optimism. Then the midday interlude of lunch, trying far too hard to be important. And finally supper, grand, exhausted, and often crashing onto our plates without explanation. But where did these come from? Did people always eat this way? Well, not quite. In fact, if you tried to explain brunch to a medieval peasant, they'd likely assume you were dangerously underfed or just showing off. Back in the early medieval days, especially during the early Middle Ages, when books were chained to desks and personal hygiene was an act of rebellion, eating had less to do with culinary timing and more to do with sunlight, monasteries, and digestion, which is as delightful a trio as any. Let's start with the monks, those grand inventors of routine and bells. In monasteries, the daily schedule was dictated by the divine office, a gloriously rigid system of prayers and chants, meticulously timed throughout the day. Meals were slotted between prayers, and since medieval monks considered bodily needs mildly suspicious at best, the goal was to eat just enough to keep chanting, but not enough to feel cheerful about it. This meant that for monks, the first and often only main meal was eaten around midday, known as dinner. Supper, the evening meal, was lighter and sometimes skipped altogether, especially during Lent or other pious guilt fests. As for breakfast, that was considered thoroughly unfashionable. Eating too early was once seen as a sign of gluttony, perhaps even decadence. One 15th century moralist implied that if you needed to eat in the morning, the devil probably lived in your stomach. And you thought skipping breakfast was a health trend. It was, in fact, a salvation strategy. Yet the tides shift, as they always do, and by the late Middle Ages, the structure of meals began to reflect one's social status. Nobles, widely known for having both food and time to waste, embraced multiple mealtimes with extravagance. They might enjoy a nuncheon between mid-morning prayers and the next hunt, a swift bite of bread, cheese, and light wine, taken for strength, not pleasure. Although, let's be honest, wine at 10 a.m. has a way of blurring that line. Meanwhile, peasants operated on an entirely different schedule, one dictated not by bells, but by their aching backs and the position of the sun. A farm labourer might rise before dawn and grab a crust of bread, probably as hard as medieval life itself, washed down with small beer or pottage before heading to the fields. Their primary meal came around midday when work paused, and the sun held its breath at the top of the sky. Evening meals were often modest, if they existed at all, a hot stew if lucky, a cold sigh if not. So where did our modern meal pattern come from? Ironically, it owes much to industrialization. By the 18th and 19th centuries, factories stole the sun's scheduling job, and meal times became rigid to match the whistle's blow. Workers were granted lunch breaks, an odd novelty at the time, and began to cherish evenings, finally home, and sitting with entire loaves of introspection and potatoes. Thus, 3-meal days were cemented not by monks or lords, but by machines and men in waistcoats, and yet the names lingered. Dinner still floats confusingly between noon and night, depending on where you're from. Supper tends to show up in the rural corners of conversation, smelling of biscuits and heavily buttered nostalgia. And breakfast has somehow been rebranded as a necessary daily accomplishment involving avocados, public proof of wellness, and the occasional performative smoothie. Odd, isn't it, that after centuries of changing candle stub schedules, we still eat 3 meals as if we're clocking in at a medieval monastery. The world has spun fast and loud since those cloistered halls first echoed with stomach growls. But their rhythms, like sleepy echoes, hum beneath our daily lives. And in the soft unfolding pages of time, there's always another curious tradition waiting at the edge of the candlelight. Imagine a world where you're told who to love, when to eat, and what to wear, by a church bell, a guy with a trumpet, and a man wearing tights and yelling things in the town square. Well, you're not imagining too hard. We're still living under the long, starch-collared shadow of medieval time management. Time as we know it didn't always tick by with the smooth smugness of your phone screen's lock display. In medieval Europe, life moved more like a lazy donkey cart rather than a thoroughbred schedule. But thanks to the tightly belted, candlelit minds of the Middle Ages, we inherited a few bizarre habits, like lunch at noon, work weeks, and the obsession with punctuality, which didn't really matter before there were quartz watches or corporate emails. You see, back in the 9th century, Charlemagne, that famously wakeful emperor who, according to some sources, only slept 4 hours a night, and according to Sanity, was probably very tired, tried to standardize time for monks, so they wouldn't spill their soup at random hours or miss matins. Monastic life required rigor, 7 prayers a day, spread out like jam over the full toasted loaf of daytime. These canonical hours divided into prime, terce, sext, and none, which sounds like a medieval countdown to nap time, governed everything. And not just monks began to mimic these rhythms, but eventually towns, guilds, and even farmers dragged into someone else's spiritual calendar. Now here's where it gets cozy, and a little weird. The working day, that efficient little monster lurking beneath most of our mental calendars. Yeah, that's medieval too. Monks pioneered a kind of shift work, taking turns at prayer, chores, cheese making, and manuscript copying. Essentially, the first freelancers, minus the Wi-Fi and existential dread. This idea bled into feudal society, where peasants were technically required to labor for their lord a set number of days a week. But those days were often broken up by countless holy festivals, fasts, and feast days. For example, Saint Monday, not recognized by the church, but thoroughly beloved by the working class, who often chose to rest on Mondays due to excessive feasting, or mostly beer, on Sundays, a medieval hangover holiday, if you will. Still, over time, the church and guilds wrestled daily life into predictable segments. Bells rang at designated hours, morning prayers, noon meat dangling, evening rest. They were the medieval snooze button. By the 14th century, cities began installing town clocks atop towers, but not the clocks we know today. These had only an hour hand and occasionally a very offbeat rooster-shaped weather vane that turned when the wind was fed up with everyone's nonsense. These bells didn't chime solely for the honor of a sentient schedule. They served as sonic reminders. Time to open the gates. Time to arm the drawbridge. Time to stop selling cabbages. Time to repent your sins and remember you're probably going to be judged alongside the cabbages. And so, time became externalized. Monks, kings, and town criers effectively shouting to people, "Now is now," which feels oddly familiar because we still live by external nudges, alarms, alerts, notifications. Medieval time management is alive and giggling in our pockets. It's just traded bell towers for Bluetooth. One practice that clings soft and stubborn like lint to a woolen cloak is the lunch hour. In the medieval schema, the canonical hour called sext happened, not scandalously, but around midday. Monks would stop, say their prayers, and then, oh yes, snack modestly. Over time, this tradition of breaking bread in the middle of the day percolated into the common habits of townsfolk and workers. By the Renaissance, lunch became a cozy little punctuation mark in the social script, though it didn't officially get its delicious title until around the 18th century. Still, the spirit of it, holy rest in the name of soup, was undeniably medieval. And let's not forget the 9 to 5-ish routine. Many think it's an invention of factories and the Industrial Revolution, but no, the strand of regular work followed by regulated pauper recreation was already entwined into the medieval day. Prayer, toil, repeat. The real twist: medieval people might have worked fewer hours than we do. They observed dozens of saint days, seasonal breaks, and randomly fantastic excuses like, "It's too rainy to plough." In contrast, modern workers are lucky to get coffee that isn't lukewarm. So next time you glance at the clock or feel guilty for taking an afternoon nap, just remember, you're merely honoring the ancient rhythm of monastic cheesemakers. That calendar reminder, a digital version of Brother Benedict banging a bong. And as the bells of quaint town towers fade into the evening mist and time presses softly forward, we drift further down the cobbled paths of custom and curious inheritance toward a subject even more delightfully absurd. Have you ever signed a contract and wondered why your signature needed that peculiar cursive flair? Why, pray tell, does everyone rush to sign on the dotted line, as though those tiny dots hold legal sorcery? Well, gather your parchment and dip your imaginary quill, because we're about to wade gently into the dreamy world of medieval signatures and the exceedingly strange things people once did to prove they meant what they wrote, back when most couldn't write at all. In medieval England and much of Europe, signing a document wasn't a matter of scrawling your name in ink. That would have taken literacy, a luxury reserved for priests, monks, and the odd noble with a patient tutor. For everyone else, X marked the spot. Quite literally, the humble X became the people's champion, a universal placeholder that quietly whispered, "I was here and I agree, probably." What's even more charming is that the X wasn't just a mark. It was often kissed. Yes, kissed. After someone placed their mark on a document, they might press their lips to it in solemn affirmation. The act of kissing the X gave rise to the term "sealed with a kiss." And now every mail-sent Valentine has unintentionally nodded to a medieval legal ritual that involved no chocolates, but curiously similar levels of commitment. But let's not drift past the real stars of medieval authenticity, seals. Not the flippered kind that bark on beaches, but waxy blobs pressed with signet rings, tiny, personalized stamps made of metal. Each noble family had their own. Lions rampant, dragons coiled, or maybe a smug little sparrow with a sword. These seals were not just decorative, they were serious business. A sealed document, pressed with hot wax and emblazoned with your emblem, was akin to a notarized contract humming with aristocratic sincerity. If your ring fell into the wrong hands, oh dear, chaos might ensue. Forged seals could shift alliances, grant false land ownership, or secure weddings between people who hadn't even met. It was somewhere between Tinder and kingdom-wide identity theft. In fact, losing your signet ring was such a serious security breach that people would sometimes have to announce in public that their seal was no longer valid. Essentially, the medieval version of cancelling a credit card. But then came the flourish signature, that elegant scribble we now rehearse in the quiet shade of post offices and waiting rooms. The concept of the name signature didn't really take off until the late Middle Ages, when a merchant class began slipping into positions of power. These were people who might not have lands or titles, but had enough accounting experience to fill a barn with double entry ledgers. And so emerged the need for a personal stamp of credibility that didn't involve melting wax or kissing marks, the signature. By the 15th century, people were not just signing, but developing their own autograph style, occasionally adding Latin phrases or unnecessary loops because it made them look more learned and somehow wealthier. This signature as persona idea stuck hard, and centuries later, we're still awkwardly attempting to make ours look authoritative when we sign for a package or scribble on a wedding card. Even the dotted line, oh, that precious persistent line, has its roots in medieval scripting. Scribes would leave blank spaces for names or signatures, carefully ruled with dots so the script would stay aligned. Those little dots helped guide the feather of a quill to behave itself, lest the signature wander like a tipsy minstrel. To this day, the dotted line is an invisible leash on our written promises, gently coaxing us to conform. It's a relic of parchment etiquette, a quiet ghost of an era when ink was precious and the act of agreeing in writing needed a touch of ceremony. So next time you're slogging through paperwork, pausing at the dotted line as if engaging in ancient ritual, well, in a way, you are. You're reenacting the cautious choreography of centuries past, where people made their mark, melted their wax, kissed their agreement into existence, and hoped that no one ran off with their seal. And as we lower our metaphorical quill and rest our parchment-creased hands, let us quietly tiptoe toward a different kind of old rule, one dressed in trousers, or the suspicious lack thereof, in the hushed corridors of medieval society where parchment held more power than persuasion and wigs slowly crept onto foreheads like powdered caterpillars. There existed a stubborn, perennial idea that you should only use your right hand. Yes, let us meander through the curious legacy of right-handedness, an idea so delightfully arbitrary, it managed to cross centuries wearing the same stiff leather gloves. In medieval Europe, being left-handed was not simply inconvenient, it was downright suspicious. A left-handed scribe could be accused of dealing with the devil, not metaphorically, but very literally. The word sinister, which now just means a touch creepy, like a doll that blinks by itself, was originally simply Latin for left. Meanwhile, dexter, the root of our word dexterous, meant right. That's right. Right was always right. How convenient. This bias wasn't just linguistic. It was baked into everything. Architecture, sword fighting, and even table manners. Swordplay instructors would only teach right-handed techniques because ambidextrous knights were feared as unpredictable. And naturally, in most castle dining halls, everyone sat with their sword hand, right, facing outward. If someone brandished a chicken leg with their left, it was unclear whether they meant supper or treason. The church, always fashionably late to modernity, also weighed in with their usual flair for subtlety. Priests conducted blessings with their right hand, and left-handed nuns were gently encouraged to stop. John of Tynemouth, a 14th century chronicler, once mentioned a boy born entirely left-handed and referred to him with the same tone one might use to describe a goat attending law school. But here's the real secret that hangs like cobwebs in the alcove of tradition. We still kneel to this ancient prejudice every time we shake hands with our right, salute with our right, or refuse to trust a pair of left-handed scissors. Consider the classroom. For centuries, yes, centuries, school children have been subjected to that peculiar form of medieval conditioning, the forced use of the right hand. It became so standard that desks were designed with a little flip-out shelf, always on the right. Left-handed pupils have bobbed and curled around these constraints like acrobats at a desk-bound circus. Of course, the truth lies not in divine mandate, but in plain practicality, tinged with an excess of unfounded suspicion. Most people happen to be right-handed, roughly 90% even today, so naturally societies catered to this majority. But medieval Europe, ever fond of a good superstition, went further and called your dominant hand a moral failing. Sinister indeed. But lest we imagine this paranoid handedness as a strictly European indulgence, let's widen the tapestry. In Japan, a left-handed wife could apparently be grounds for divorce, although whether this rule was more about chopsticks than chivalry remains debated. And in the Islamic world, right-handedness was championed in etiquette. To eat, shake hands, and perform ablutions. Left was reserved for, well, significantly less blessed activities. So it wasn't just superstition. It was policy, etiquette, architecture, marital law, and calligraphy, all subtly intimidating the southpaw into compliance. But like most things medieval, there was an ironic twist. While left-handed scribes were discouraged, left-handed archers were oddly prized in battle. See, while the infantry marched in tidy right-dominant lines, a left-handed archer could surprise their enemy by firing from an unguarded angle. Lefties were thus both blamed for witchcraft and hailed as war-winning secrets, the military equivalent of being everyone's least favorite cheat code. Over time, of course, logic came knocking. Laws softened, furniture evolved. Someone somewhere finally invented a lefty-friendly can opener. But the cultural lag remains. We still shake with our right, salute with our right, teach piano with a right-hand bias, and suspiciously watch left-handers scribble across the page like they're up to something profoundly creative or criminal. And so, every time you reach your right hand out in automatic politeness, know this: you're performing a tiny echo of medieval anxiety, the papery whisper of a time when directionality was doctrine. But before you go sprouting ambidextrous rebellion, gently roll over this next curiosity. Why are office suits modelled after knights' armour? And what on earth do shoulder pads have to do with jousting? Let's explore. Imagine this. You're standing at the edge of your favourite grocery store aisle, the one that smells suspiciously like both cleaning products and despair, and you're politely waiting for someone to move their cart. But instead of just barging through with the reckless abandon of a caffeinated squirrel, you stand on the right, not the left, always the right. Why? Because, dear dreamer, even today, in this neon-lit, serial-overloaded century, we are still following medieval traffic patterns, indoors and out. Let's slowly roll back the centuries, as if rewinding a VHS tape inside a time-traveling toaster. In the winding streets of medieval Europe, people generally walked, or trotted, or clip-clopped on the left side of the road. Yes, the left. It seems counterintuitive now, until you remember that most people were right-handed and sword-carrying. Walking on the left kept your sword arm free to, well, diplomatically resolve disagreements, should any arise. Sword first, talk later. This custom stuck around until the late 18th century in many places. But then came one of the most powerful forces known to history, the French, specifically revolutionary France. In 1794, post-guillotine enthusiasm was everywhere, and the old ways were considered not just old, but dangerously royal. The aristocrats had favoured left-side travel, so naturally the new folks in charge, keen to slice away any trace of the old regime, insisted that everyone should now keep to the right instead. Voila. Napoleon, being a man of unrivaled hat drama and horse confidence, spread this right-side rule across much of Europe through conquest and, one suspects, sheer stubbornness. But wait, it gets twistier. In places that resisted Napoleon's influence, like Britain, driving and walking on the left remained the norm. And so, from France's revolutionary sidewalks to England's royal carriageways, a continental divide was born. When the automobile rambled onto the scene like a smoky, clattering gremlin in the late 19th century, countries had already picked a side. A literal side. Flash forward to your modern hallway standoff with a co-worker approaching from the opposite direction. Neither of you wants to make the first move. You zig, they zag. And now, oh no, you're both doing the awkward hallway dance. The cause? Centuries of unresolved medieval left-right neuroses, now performed not with horses and swords, but Fitbits and resentful eye contact. Even online, our scrolling preferences have medieval echoes. The way we navigate websites, from top left to bottom right, is a ghostly remnant of Western manuscripts and illuminated Bibles, where monks painstakingly etched gold-dipped letters and doodled snarky rabbits in the margins, always left to right. There's something wonderfully irrational about how these habits linger like a particularly clingy goose. We no longer ride horseback through winding medieval hamlets, yet the magnetic pull of stay to the right hums beneath our modern lives, guiding escalator etiquette and robot vacuum navigation alike. But it wasn't just about where you strolled or rode. Entire city layouts were arranged according to medieval rules that still shape our neighborhoods. Ever wonder why downtown streets sometimes suddenly narrow for no reason, like a hallway designed by someone who hated elbows? That's often because 1,000 years ago, someone built a tavern beside a smithy next to a goat path, and the town just never unstuck itself. Urban planning in the Middle Ages was less meticulous blueprint, and more the pig lives here now, build around it. And thus even your daily commute, that tedious trudge through tangles of traffic cones and mysteriously angry drivers, is partly a conversation with the medieval past. A past that decided, without consensus or clear signage, that left was noble, right was revolutionary, and alleyways should always be just wide enough to question your life choices. Eventually, these patterns trickled down from nobility to commoners, and from peasants to programmers. You're not just walking on the right because it's polite. You're reenacting a cultural compromise forged by sword-wielding knights, dramatic French legislation, and that one cart-driving monk who blocked the entire market lane in 1272. And so the dance continues, centuries later, with souvenirs of medieval logic rattling in our pockets like forgotten keys. Which brings us gently now to a curious little structure with pointy spires and whispering walls. A place that still shapes the way we treat authority today, in ways you wouldn't expect. Let us stroll quietly into the medieval marriage of madness and measurement. Yes, tonight we're tucking ourselves into the comforting absurdity of the foot, that enduring little unit of measurement that has stubbornly tiptoed its way across 8 centuries with all the grace of a man balancing soup bowls on stilts. Imagine, if you will, a babbling Middle English marketplace, chickens doing chicken things, someone bartering with alarming passion over a single onion, and a town crier who seems a little too enthusiastic about boiled turnip week. Amid this reasonable chaos, a local builder is attempting to order 3 feet of timber. But there's a problem. Whose foot should we use? For you see, before standardization, a foot was, as the name delightfully suggests, actually based on a human foot, but not just any foot. In many places, it was either the king's foot, the local lord's foot, or occasionally, a man everyone agreed had a good sensible foot. In fairness, when your entire community is sizing things based on parts of one guy, he becomes oddly famous in town. Old Jeff. Ah yes, his foot's the one they used to measure the church door. Lovely arch that, all 12 Jeffs wide. Eventually, Europe, tired of all this foot wrangling, decided to standardize. Around the 12th century, King Henry I of England supposedly declared that the foot should be officially 12 inches. That's roughly the length of his own foot, if myth is to be believed. So in perhaps the most royal of plot twists, the entire imperial system we still use today in kitchens and on shoe shopping websites was allegedly born from Henry's regal hoof. Now, 12 inches might seem like a random number, but the medieval mind loved a good dozen. It was mathematically friendly, divisible into halves, thirds, and quarters. Handy when you're trying to divide cloth or work out how much fence you can afford before sundown. Base 10 was fine for counting fingers, but base 12? Oh, that was poetry. Eggs, inches, shillings. If it could be measured or traded, it usually came in 12s, because why use 10 fingers when you can throw in your knuckles too? And so, despite the later revolutionary spark of the metric system, with its sensible tens and its daring rejection of people's body parts, places like the United States clung to the imperial system like a nostalgic blanket. What began as a medieval approximation of foot size, woven with a dash of royal idiosyncrasy, is now how we measure televisions, pick out baking trays, and figure out whether a couch will fit through the front door. Speaking of doors, fun fact draped in velvet, medieval building measurements weren't always in feet or inches. Some places used hands, about 4 inches, fathoms, roughly your height, arms stretched out, or the poetically vague pace. In many cases, the builder doing the measurements would pace back and forth, and that would be the official length, until Jeff came along and pointed out that Lewis the Mason had a suspiciously long stride. But modern echoes of this whimsy still tick beneath our boots. When we measure horses, we still do it in hands, nail sizes, measured in pennies, another medieval leftover, and in some circles, especially the deeply ocean-going ones, a fathom is still very much a thing. Why? Because once a measurement sticks in the bones of habit, it's rather hard to peel it out. It becomes baked into blueprints, into packages, into parents' exaggerated tales of how tall you were as a toddler. This many feet, a tower of chubbiness. And so, the medieval foot, born of a king who may or may not have had impressively symmetrical toes, walks quietly beside us still. So tonight, as you adjust your pillows, perhaps fluffed precisely 1 foot apart, think fondly of the centuries of squabbling over which human limb should govern wooden planks and garden plots, and marvel that deep down, We are all still measuring the world by someone's old sandal, drifting now slowly, gently into the next corridor of curiosity, where coins make less sense than you think, and pennies once ruled with a twinkle in their copper eye. Shh. Listen closely. Can you hear it? The heavy thud of ceremonial shoes, squeaking faintly on marble, so polished it's a hazard and a half. Yes, we are about to tiptoe into the medieval chamber of etiquette. That's right, the ghostly rulebook of polite society, drafted in candlelight by monks with quills and probably more free time than necessary, still whispers its instructions across dinner tables and awkward elevator rides today. Take, for instance, table manners. You may have been scolded by a grandparent or glared at by a particularly strict salad fork, but did you know that the code of conduct dictating how we behave at meals was penned, quite literally, over mead and trenchers? In the Middle Ages, the table was not just for food, it was for performance. One was expected to sit up straight, chew like the nobility of one's chin depended on it, and never, under any circumstance, lick your fingers, unless you were a peasant, in which case fingers were often the only utensils available, and licking them was frankly just good resource management. The origin of modern manners begins with manuals such as Urbanus Magnus by Daniel of Beccles around 1200. This elegant scroll of wisdom provided timeless advice like, do not blow your nose into the tablecloth, which, hilariously, some medieval diners apparently needed to be told. Imagine being so esteemed by society that someone had to remind you not to repurpose the royal linen as tissues. Another delight, the rule that says elbows must not touch the table. Now, while this edict has taught millions the art of perching precariously at mealtime, its medieval roots weren't about manners, they were about logistics. Medieval dining tables were often narrow wooden planks resting on trestles. Plopping your elbows down was less an offence to civility and more a risk of tipping the pot roast into someone's lap. Turns out, balance was the original etiquette enforcer. And what about the bizarre custom of not starting to eat until the host has taken their first bite? Medieval feasts were ranked by hierarchy sharper than a jousting lance. No one dared to raise a goblet before the noble at the head of the table began sopping his bread into the communal stew. That decorum survived, evolving into our present-day habit of staring longingly at dinner while waiting for Aunt Phyllis to stop describing her hip surgery in excruciating detail and take the first scoop of mashed potatoes. But perhaps the most curious leftover from medieval manners is the phrase, "bless you," when someone sneezes. A polite automatic murmur we utter dozens of times a year, often to strangers in supermarkets who are just as startled as we are. Its origins trace back to the Black Death, when Pope Gregory III reportedly encouraged the phrase as a quick spiritual shield. Sneezing was considered an early sign of plague, and saying "bless you" was the world's gentlest way of saying, "You've got about a week, buddy. Godspeed." Now, astonishingly, with no threat of black-robed plague doctors lurking nearby, we still reflexively offer this mini blessing, as if centuries of cough etiquette have trained us for a role in life's smallest ceremonial moments. Even the idea of holding the door open, or insisting on walking on the side of the sidewalk furthest from traffic, can be traced to medieval codes of gallantry. Knights and nobles crafted their movements around principles of protection and poise. A man walking on the outside was shielding his lady from errant wagon wheels or less savoury splashes from chamber pots hurled from above. Today, the risks have shifted from chamber pots to rogue scooters, but the instinct lingers. A redundant code, perhaps, but charmingly so. So much of what we consider proper isn't universally logical. It's historically sentimental. A whisper of the distant past, wrapped in linen doublets and crusted bread, kept alive with just a raised pinky or a courteous nod. And now, as we clear away the final imaginary trencher and let the flickering torchlight dim behind us, there's just one more peculiar medieval behavior still very much alive, yet hidden in plain sight, right between our toes. But we'll take our next step ever so gently. Somewhere between the scent of beeswax candles and the sound of distant chapel bells tolling the 9th hour, medieval folks locked in a peculiar obsession with curfews. Not just your average mom, put the kids to bed kind, no. These were state-sanctioned bedtime alarms, quite literally. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the geese gave their final honks, towns across Europe rang the cover fire bell, from the French term couvre-feu, to signal it was time to put out all open flames, shutters closed, chimneys capped. The day was over. Your fire must sleep now. You, ideally, would follow suit. The logic at the time wasn't too bad. No fire department, thatched roofs, wind. A rogue candle could easily turn your quaint little village into an urban bonfire. So the government said, lights out. The curfew bell rang, and villagers obeyed with the weary reverence usually reserved these days for last call at a pub. And believe it or not, we still have curfews today. Of course, they're less about flame containment and more about please don't gather in the skate park past 10 p.m. But the sentiment remains embarrassingly similar. Keep order. Shut things down. Try not to burn the city down, metaphorically or otherwise. But while curfews may seem quaint, another medieval relic still has a grip on us, quite literally, every time we send a formal invitation. RSVP, that inscrutable sequence of letters begging you to respond to an event you didn't ask to be invited to. It's French, of course. Répondez s'il vous plaît, which means reply if it pleases you. Somehow, it sounds simultaneously polite, threatening, and drenched in wine. But why on earth are we still French about our invitations? It harkens back to the medieval courts of Europe, where language was less about functionality and more about prestige flaunting. Latin was for laws and church things, but French was the language of fashionably excessive ruling classes. William the Conqueror brought it to England, and for a few confusing centuries, the nobles spoke French, the peasants spoke English, and nobody could understand the bakers. Etiquette, much like a peacock in church, was elaborate and unnecessary, and therefore essential. The upper classes adopted French phrases not because anyone asked them to, but because it gave everything the sweet air of exclusivity and foie gras. This linguistic snobbery wed itself to the rise of formal ceremonies, court banquets, nightly tournaments, luncheons that almost justified leaving your castle once a month. Invitations were scribed by hand, passed by messenger, and bore the kind of script that made everyone pretend they could read. Please respond became répondez s'il vous plaît. And lo, it stuck. Today, you may not carry a sword or own a feathered hat, unless you're into that sort of thing, which we wholeheartedly support. But when you email an RSVP, you're unknowingly echoing 13th century courtiership, perhaps with less ceremonial wine, unless your inbox is very advanced. While we're in this oddly formal territory, let's drift softly into the world of titles. No, not YouTube titles, the medieval kind. Sir, Madam, and my personal favourite, Your Grace, which makes going to the post office sound like a royal procession. These honorifics may seem like harmless fluff now, but they were once a furious business. If you called a Duke a count, you were in for a week of awkward eye contact at the hunting lodge, if not a light stabbing. Even now, you'll find traces in how we address letters, emails, and the occasional nurse practitioner. Mr. and Mrs. are the linguistic fossils of master and mistress, titles once bristling with social rank and occasionally suspicion. Esquire used to mean you were a knight in training. Today, it mostly means you're a lawyer who owns more than one pen. It's odd, really, that we still drape ourselves in these verbal capes long after the castles have crumbled and the dragons prove to be perfectly ordinary lizards. So the next time you say "Good night, sir," or ignore an RSVP with the quiet confidence of a peasant refusing to attend a banquet, remember somewhere a medieval monk is nodding slowly by candlelight, impressed at your commitment to tradition, or yawning. It's probably both. Let's gently turn the parchment of history once more, where another peculiar rule awaits, still very much in play, centuries later, for reasons no one quite remembers. There's a quiet kind of rebellion hiding in your sock drawer. Wait, come back. Let me explain. You see, the reason you put on socks first, then pants, then shoes, is not just because your body demands order, or because hopping around one-legged trying to reach your foot with a tube of cotton is harder than it looks. No, the real answer might lie somewhere around the 13th century, tangled in linen hose and modesty laws. In the Middle Ages, getting dressed was less about looking good and more about saving your soul, from embarrassment, of course. People wore layers like onions wore secrets. First, a linen chemise, then hose, those long-footed stockings you had to tie up with garters, followed by tunics, surcoats, and optional armor if your Tuesday looked joust heavy. But more than fashion, getting dressed the correct way was considered a moral duty. The church had thoughts, so many thoughts, on how one should layer, in what order, and how tight your hose should really be. Too snug? Well, now you are posing a spiritual danger to passers-by, and we can't have that. So putting socks on first? That became a sign of virtue, or at least of being properly taught by someone's grim Aunt Hildegard. And while we've lost the tunics and the garters, unless you're at a themed wedding, we still follow the sequence, centuries later, without question. A little medieval modesty tucked into your daily routine. Speaking of modesty, let's talk dining etiquette, shall we? Imagine you're at a feast in a candlelit hall, and someone passes you a platter of roast swan. You don't just stab it with your dagger and growl. Perish the thought. There were rules. Whole manuals dedicated to table manners existed, written for noble children who were apparently born with the table behavior of raccoons. Books like The Book of Courtesy or The Young Gentleman's Book of Manners, and also of Things Not to Be Done, except on pain of glaring disapproval. Okay, that last one may be dramatized. Laid out critical guidelines. Don't blow on your stew. Don't scratch yourself at the table. And whatever you do, do not lick your knife. That last one stuck. Licking your knife was considered deeply suspect, part hygiene, part menace. The knife was the multi-tool of the day. It sat at the heart of every meal and, occasionally, every duel. So when you licked it clean, you weren't just rude. You were basically saying, I have questionable instincts and might stab the pudding. Even today, the rule lingers. Lick your fork. Mild rebuke. Lick your knife. Scandal. All thanks to medieval sensibilities that equated impropriety with impending doom. Another survivor from feasts of old, the order of toasts. In medieval courts, the person of highest rank toasted first. Then, others raised their goblets in descending order of importance. It was like a pecking order with more wine and fewer feathers. Stepping out of line could lead to a clashing of cups, or worse, egos, so naturally, everyone obeyed. These days, we still echo that protocol. At formal weddings, the father of the bride often speaks first, then come the best man, the maid of honor, and so on. Each speech, a little legacy of feudal hierarchy, delivered with modern anecdotes and, occasionally, limoncello, shots. But perhaps the most enduring and questionably useful legacy of all is the hand we offer in greeting. Shake on it, people say, holding out their right hand, as if the left had just returned from a suspicious errand. This preference isn't just about dominant limbs. In medieval times, the right hand was presumed to be weapon-free. Offering it meant, "Look, I'm not about to gut you. Let's be friends." This practice took root among knights and merchants, and over time, morphed into the handshake we know today, a symbol of peace, trust, and social contract, though now more likely to transmit those weird hand sanitizer smells than actual threats. Even the overhand grip of the modern handshake harks back to older customs of grasping forearms as a subtle weapon check. So next time someone gives you a firm shake, smile and remember, it's basically a small, polite duel with eye contact. Funny, isn't it? All the little rituals we uphold, passed down like family recipes, flavored with just a hint of medieval drama. But there's more where that came from, especially when we follow our noses into the realm of ancient cleanliness, or what medieval people considered cleanliness, which is a fascinatingly different kettle of soap. Picture this. It's a cloud-soft twilight in a quaint English village, say somewhere with a name like Nether Snugglington upon Fluff, a place where time itself politely doffs its cap and shuffles a little slower. The chimneys puff like dozing cats, and in the shadow of the old stone church, a curious relic of medieval bureaucracy still, somehow, perseveres. The inexplicably enduring art of ringing the curfew bell, now curfew. That deliciously French-sounding word, curfew, comes from couvre-feu, literally meaning cover fire. Back in the 11th century, when William the Conqueror was freshly installed and probably still fumbling with his new keys to England, he imposed this rule. At the toll of the evening bell, everyone was to snuff out their hearth fires and stop whatever suspicious medieval nonsense they were up to. It was meant to prevent fires in the mostly wooden cities and, let's be honest, control any gatherings that might smell a bit too much like rebellion. The bell would ring, and townsfolk, like obedient little loaves of sourdough, were expected to fall into line. Fires out, shoes off, gossip paused. A forced bedtime centuries before sleep hygiene had its day on Instagram. And yet, in certain parts of Britain and Europe, those curfew bells still ring, as they have for nearly 1,000 years. Today, of course, no one rushes home to throw a fire blanket over their chimneys. Most people just assume it's the church clock being musical. But there it is, an echo of a law nobody enforces anymore, punctuating the air like a grandfather clock who refuses to retire. Now, if you're wondering why we're still whisper cosplaying William the Conqueror's bedtime rules, you're not alone. It seems society simply developed a nostalgic fondness for the comforting clang of temporal structure. Much like cats fond of cardboard boxes, we humans just love a good routine, even one based entirely on long extinct fire hazards and medieval worry. Yet, bells aren't the only medieval holdover woven into our daily tapestry. No, let's amble over, soft shoes only please, to the curious case of the black and white clothing rule. In ye olden courts of law, when people still believed bathing attracted illness and wigs were high fashion, judges robed themselves in austere black and white. This wasn't just a fashion choice. Black symbolized humility and impartiality. White, purity and innocence. Although, frankly, if you've ever read about how certain 13-year-old barons got away with treason, purity and innocence might make you chuckle out loud. Politely, of course. But flash forward to today, and our modern judges are still in their black robes. The powdered wigs have mostly been retired, though some British courts still admire their woolly advice. But the cloak of dramatic fashion persists. Do they need to wear them? Not really. Could justice be delivered in athleisure by a judge sipping oat milk? Theoretically, yes. But tradition, like an over-enthusiastic aunt, insists we dress up for the occasion. Okay, here's another crumb of medieval etiquette. Handshaking. You might think shaking hands is a modern sign of friendliness. But no. Welcome back to the Middle Ages, dear dreamer. In those thrilling times, shaking hands was less about trust and more about, please notice I'm not concealing a dagger up my sleeve. It was rooted in mutual self-preservation. You'd extend your right hand, your sword-swinging hand, open and empty, as if to say, look, Geoffrey, I would have stabbed you by now if I meant to. A shake sealed the deal, literally proving your hand was not full of mischief or medieval cutlery. Of course, over the centuries, we took that anxious gesture of weapon checks and turned it into a polite business formality, even though office politics today require entirely new forms of armor. So from curfew bells to judicial robes, from dagger-dodging handshakes to reverent bedtime rituals, we continue echoing rules written in a time when personal hygiene meant owning one comb between 12 siblings. We don't really need these practices, but perhaps some feather-soft part of our psyche likes them. They make us feel tethered to something older, something slower. A time when evenings were measured by bells, justice was clothed in symbolism, and shaking hands was how nights ensured no one got unexpectedly skewered at book club. And so, as the curfew bell softly rings across the centuries, we follow it. Not because we must, but because in some sleepy corner of ourselves, we like knowing that time still hums the old lullaby. Let your thoughts linger there, just a breath behind the last echo of that forgotten bell. As we quietly tiptoe toward a tale steeped in even stranger survival, one that might just be hiding in your pocket, have you ever wondered why we raise our right hand to take an oath, or feel an inexplicable reverence for a judge simply because they're wearing a robe, standing slightly higher than us, and occasionally smashing things with a wooden mallet? Welcome, dear listener, to yet another medieval mystery still baked into our modern day like a stale meat pie no one dared question at the banquet. Let's start with the curious case of the raised right hand. Today, it's a symbol of honesty, used in everything from courtrooms to swearing-in ceremonies to that awkward moment when someone in a meeting asks, "Who didn't read the email?" But this little gesture has deep roots tangled up in medieval justice systems and, rather delightfully, the human tendency to point at body parts in lieu of paperwork. In England, before fingerprints and spreadsheets, the legal system had a far more hands-on approach. Literally, when someone was found guilty in court, especially of theft, their hand, yes, their actual biological hand, might be branded. A hot iron in the shape of a letter, like T for thief, would be pressed into the flesh, leaving a permanent scalding reminder of their courtroom cameo. So if that person found themselves in court again later, they'd be asked to raise their hand to reveal the previous branding. No brand, first offense. Branded. Well, back again, are we? the right hand, being dominant for most, and therefore more useful for both stealing and revealing, got the starring role. Over time, the burning stopped, thank goodness. But the gesture stuck around. What once was "show me your criminal record on your skin" turned into a solemn pledge of truth. Comforting, isn't it? And now to those cloaked figures looming over us in courts and ceremonies, the keepers of law and roast-worthy Latin phrases, the judges. Their black robes may give them the appearance of medieval vampire scholars, but the origins are humble enough. In the early Middle Ages, judges didn't wear black. In fact, before the 14th century, judicial attire was all over the fashion palette. Blues, purples, and even cheerful reds. It was a colourful time for sentencing. Then came a gloomy little event in 17th century England. King Charles II died in 1685, and judges donned black robes during the mourning period out of respect. The mourning ended, but the black robes did not. Apparently, everyone looked so serious and authoritative, they just kept the look. Thus, an impromptu fashion choice in grief evolved into a centuries-old uniform of solemn justice. Oh, and the elevated bench. It dates back to Roman tradition, but the medieval twist made it even more dramatic. By physically placing a judge higher, it symbolized their closer proximity to divine judgment. If that seems a touch theatrical, remember, medieval courts were half legal procedure, half morality play. Today, the steps up to the bench may just be hazard zones for clumsy lawyers, but the symbolism sticks. Justice, literally, remains on a pedestal. And now, let us saunter gently into the curious rhythm of time itself. Consider the 7-day week, a little time-worn calendar piece we rarely question. Why 7? Not 8, not 5, not even a well-rounded 10. Surprise again. We can blame a mix of biblical tradition and ancient Babylonian stargazing, sweetly adopted and reinforced by medieval Christendom. The Babylonians noticed 7 wandering stars in the sky. Planets, really. But they didn't know that yet. Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Each got a day. The Judeo-Christian world liked the biblical God took 6 days to build the earth, then said nah on Sunday. And voila, the 7-day week trudged into modern life by way of medieval monasteries, where bells rang at regular intervals to remind monks it was time to pray, time to eat, or accidentally invent wine. This ancient weekly schedule, built from stars, scripture, and sleepy monks, now rules our lives. We plan vacations by it, write despondent pop songs about Monday, and dread Sunday evenings like clockwork. There is, perhaps, no more quietly powerful medieval relic in our lives than the invisible metronome of the work week. So tonight, as you drift into your long-awaited repose, consider the subtle echoes of the Middle Ages that tick-tock through your calendar, gavel through your judgments, and raise your right hand toward habit. In this soft, sleepy continuum of customs, we are all just a little bit medieval. Rest easy. We'll lace up the final thread together, softly, in just a moment. And so, lantern flickering low and the fire sighing its final breath of warmth, we step delicately onto our last cobblestone path of medieval marvels. This one paved not in laws or fabrics or curious utensils, but in time itself. Yes, my drowsy and delightful companion. Let's have a little sigh through the meandering lanes of the medieval conception of the week. That seemingly harmless 7-day sandwich of productivity and confusion. The idea of 7 days has been quietly structuring our lives since, roughly forever. Sunday scaries and Monday blues. You can tip your hat at Babylonian astronomers and early religious planners. You see, those ancient stargazers noticed 7 particular celestial trinkets: the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, an A-list cast for any cosmic soap opera. And they decided, quite sensibly at the time, that each day should be ruled by one of these glittering divas. Fast forward to the medieval period, and that ancient planner system had become law, ritual, and socio-emotional reality, all rolled up into a calendar that millions still follow, even though most of us haven't asked Venus's opinion in years. But here's the medieval twist on the week that will surely tickle your sleepy synapses. They believed each day had its own character, its own invisible mood swings. So Monday, grumpy and grim, echoed the melancholic moon. Tuesday was ruled by Mars, making it a splendid day to pick a fight, preferably with your enemies, but really anyone would do. Wednesday, the messenger day, fluttered on the wings of Mercury, making it perfect for writing letters or gossiping about people whose names you couldn't spell. Thursday, Jupiter's domain, was jovial and wise, making it advisable for decisions and, oddly, feasting. Friday was all Venus, ideal for love, romance, or perhaps preparing fish for Lent. Saturday belonged to that old slowpoke Saturn, a day overshadowed by solemn vibes and, for peasants, endless chores. And Sunday, that was the sun's day, radiant, warm, and preferably free of labour more strenuous than humming hymns. The medieval week was less a schedule, more of a psychological roller coaster with astrological seatbelts. Nobles consulted the planets before choosing a wedding day. Apothecaries timed their medicine making to align with Mercury's moods. And barbers, yes, dear barbers, kept planetary charts to decide whether it was safe to cut a man's hair on a Thursday. Heaven forbid one tamper with Jupiter's follicles. And why the week always ends with Sunday and not, let's say, a delightful nap day called Snooze Day. That's largely thanks to the church, which anchored Sunday as the start and centerpiece of the week, a position no other day dared challenge, lest it be labeled heretical. Despite centuries of scientific advancement and the invention of email, we haven't shaken loose of this 7-day soul structure. The moods imposed by days invented for reasons long obsolete still colour our modern emotional palettes. We still fear Mondays as if the moon personally cursed us. We still assign Friday its rightful throne of joy. And somewhere, deep down, Saturn is probably still ruining someone's Saturday Netflix plans out of sheer medieval habit. But like most medieval hand-me-downs, the 7-day week isn't based on any rational division of time. It doesn't fit the moon cycle, the sun cycle, or anybody's lunch schedule. It just exists. It's cosmic cargo we carry without asking. So as you pull the warm weight of blankets over your chest and let your limbs sink into bed like knights into feathered armor, consider this. Even the most peculiar rules survive simply because no one stops to ask if we still need them. We pour our tea in a certain way, lock our doors thrice, hold our forks just so, and follow a week that tells us nothing but what we feel. And perhaps, in the slow hush of night, that's part of the magic. Echoes of medieval minds still pressing softly against our lives today, not out of tyranny or logic, but simply because they made a shape that stuck. Now rest your mind, weary wanderer of whimsical times. Let Sunday's sun warm your dreams, and let Mercury handle your messages until morning. History will still be here tomorrow, patiently snoring in a dusty corner. Sleep well,